The discovery of the Galactic Trade Summit of 2387 was supposed to be routine. Ambassador Kex Verlian had attended hundreds of these gatherings in his 3 centuries of diplomatic service. His crystalline form reflected the ambient light of the station's conference hall as he observed the proceedings with what his species considered mild interest. The Thrakari were negotiating mineral rights. The Epsilon Collective was disputing shipping lanes. Standard fare for a Tuesday in galactic politics. Then the humans arrived. Kex had worked with humans before, of course. Everyone had by this point. They'd only been part of the galactic community for 90 standard years, but their influence spread like stellar wind through a nebula. Not through conquest or economic dominance, though they were surprisingly capable at both. No, it was something else entirely. Something that made even ancient species like his own uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. The human delegation consisted of 3 individuals. Dr. Marlene Chun, a middle-aged woman with silver streaking through her black hair, led the group. Behind her walked 2 younger humans, their faces displaying that peculiar mix of confidence and curiosity that seemed hardwired into their species. They took their seats at the mediation table between the Zephrani Empire and the Kallax Consortium, who had been locked in a bitter dispute over transit rights through the Nexus corridor for the better part of a decade. Ambassador Verlian settled back to watch what would surely be another failed mediation attempt. The Zephroni were notoriously stubborn, their 6-armed bodies practically vibrating with righteous indignation whenever anyone suggested compromise. The Kallax, meanwhile, communicated primarily through biochemical signals that most species found overwhelming, making negotiation nearly impossible. 17 different mediators had tried and failed to resolve this conflict. Dr. Chun opened her briefcase and pulled out something that made every non-human in the room freeze. It was a simple coin, Earth currency from their pre-space era. She placed it on the table with a soft clink that somehow echoed through the massive hall. The Zephrani delegation leader, Prime Executor Zalth, made a grinding noise that served as their species' equivalent of a snort. His translation matrix converted his words into galactic standard. Do the humans mock these proceedings with their primitive tokens? Dr. Chun smiled, and something about that expression made Kex's crystalline structure resonate at an uncomfortable frequency. It wasn't threatening, exactly. It was the smile of someone who saw angles that shouldn't exist. Not at all, Prime Executor, Chun replied, her voice carrying that distinctive human warmth that somehow made other species want to trust them, despite all logic suggesting otherwise. I'm simply curious about probability. You see, your species believes in predetermined outcomes, correct? That the universe follows strict causal chains? Zalf's 6 arms gestured affirmatively. This is scientific fact, not belief. And the Kallax, Chun continued, turning to the amorphous beings whose biochemical communication was being translated through specialized equipment. Your people believe in quantum flux states, where multiple realities exist simultaneously, until observed. The Kallax representative's form shifted colors in agreement, releasing a complex cocktail of pheromones that the translation system interpreted as, "This is the nature of existence at the fundamental level." Chun picked up the coin. On Earth, when we can't decide something, we sometimes flip a coin. Heads or tails, 50-50 chance, pure probability. She flipped the coin into the air. Every being in the room watched it spin. The Zephrani saw predetermined trajectory. The Kallax saw quantum superposition. The other species saw a human doing something inexplicably human. The coin landed on its edge and stayed there. The silence that followed was profound. In 300 years of diplomatic service, Kex had never experienced anything quite like it. The coin shouldn't have been able to balance like that. The probability was so astronomically small that most species would have dismissed it as impossible. Dr. Chun leaned forward. Here's what's interesting about humans, distinguished colleagues. We don't see binary choices. We don't see predetermined outcomes or quantum flux. We see possibilities that haven't been invented yet. She gestured to the coin. Your conflict assumes only two outcomes. Either the Zephyrini control the corridor, or the Colax do. But what if there's a third option? The Zephyrini prime executor's arms began moving in what Kex recognized as agitation. There is no third option. The corridor either belongs to us by right of first discovery, or to them by right of current occupation. These are the only logical possibilities. Chun's smile widened. Logic is just probability, wearing a suit and tie, prime executor. Let me tell you about something we humans call the Shanghai Protocol. She pulled out a holographic projector and displayed a star map of the disputed region. But instead of showing the standard trade routes, she highlighted something else entirely. Energy patterns that nobody had thought to map before. Gravitational eddies that created natural corridors within corridors. You're both right, Chun continued. The Zephyrini did discover the corridor first. But the Colax are correct that their biological navigation methods make them the only species that can safely traverse certain sections during stellar flux periods. So why are we treating this like a single resource? The room watched as she manipulated the hologram, showing how the corridor could be divided not by space, but by time and dimensional phase. A Zephyrini fleet operates on standard temporal mechanics. The Colax exist in a slightly phase-shifted state due to their quantum biology. You're already using different aspects of the same space. You just never realized it. The Colax representative released a burst of pheromones that translated to shocked realization. The Zephyrini prime executor's 6 arms had gone completely still. Implement phase-shifted scheduling, Sean proposed. Zephyrini ships use the corridor during standard phase. Alignment. Colax vessels use it during quantum flux periods. You'll never even see each other. Both of you get full, exclusive access to the corridor, just not at the same time. And here's the beautiful part. This actually increases the corridor's total capacity by 40%. Ambassador Verlian felt his crystalline form resonate again. But this time with something approaching awe. The solution was so obvious once stated, yet no one had seen it. 17 mediators, some of the greatest minds in the galaxy, and not one had thought to question the fundamental assumption that the corridor could only be used one way. The negotiations concluded within 3 hours. Both sides left convinced. They had won because, in a very real sense, they both had. The humans had done it again. They had looked at an impossible situation and found an angle that shouldn't have existed. As the delegations filed out, Kex approached Dr. Chun. The coin, he said, gesturing to where it still stood on its edge. How did you do that? Sean picked it up and handed it to him. It was perfectly ordinary. No magnetic fields, no gravitational manipulators, nothing that would explain the impossible. Balance. I didn't do anything, Ambassador, she said with that unsettling human smile. I just flipped a coin. Sometimes, when you expect something strongly enough, when you believe in a possibility that others say can't exist, the universe gets curious and decides to take a look. She left him standing there, holding an ordinary Earth coin, wondering. If humans were somehow fundamentally different from every other species in ways that transcended simple biology, that was the day Kex Verlian began keeping records. Every time humans were involved in negotiations, mediations, or conflicts, he documented the outcomes. The pattern that emerged was both impossible and undeniable. Humans didn't just solve problems. They found solutions that shouldn't exist. They looked at binary choices and somehow discovered third, fourth, even fifth options that no amount of logic or quantum computing could have predicted. Council's xenobiology department had studied human neural patterns extensively. They were remarkably similar to other mammalian species, with no obvious anatomical advantages. Their brains weren't larger, their neural connections weren't faster, their chemical processes weren't more efficient. By all measurable metrics, humans should have been average. Yet here was Dr. Chun, 2 weeks later, mediating a territorial dispute between two hive minds that communicated in mathematical equations. The conflict had persisted for 50 years, because each hive could prove, mathematically, that their claim was correct. The math was flawless on both sides, which should have been impossible. Chun's solution? She introduced them to something humans called imaginary numbers, and showed them how both their equations were correct if you calculated them in different mathematical dimensions. The hives were so fascinated, they forgot about the territory. Entirely and formed a joint research collective to explore human mathematical concepts. Kex documented it all. The pattern was undeniable. Humans weren't just lucky. They weren't just creative. They were something else entirely. Something that made the universe itself pay attention when they suggested that maybe, just maybe, the rules weren't as fixed as everyone thought. Asterisk. The revelation the Quantum Council convened an emergency session 6 months after the Shanghai Protocol incident. Representatives from 47 species gathered in the null space chamber aboard Sentinel Station, a location specifically chosen for its isolation from any form of external probability influence. They had one agenda item, determining what humans actually were. Kex Verlian presented his findings to the assembled council. 300 documented cases of human-mediated solutions that defied conventional probability. Trade negotiations where both sides somehow gained more than they gave. Military conflicts that ended with all parties stronger than before. Scientific paradoxes resolved by humans simply suggesting that perhaps the paradox was the point. The arch calculator of the machine collective, a pure artificial intelligence that existed as distributed consciousness across 17 star systems, processed the data for 0.3 seconds before responding. Statistical anomaly of this magnitude suggests external manipulation of probability matrices. Humans appear to be unconscious reality manipulators. The chamber erupted in harmonious chaos, each species expressing disbelief in their own unique way. The Zephyrinae drummed their 6 arms against their carapaces. The Colax released clouds of alarmed pheromones. The crystalline Vithari, Kex's own people, resonated at frequencies that would have shattered glass if any had been present. It was the arrival of Captain Jake Morrison that silenced them all. The humans shouldn't have been there. The chamber was secured by 17 layers of quantum encryption, phase-shifted outside normal spacetime, and accessible only to those with explicit council authorization. Yet there he stood in the doorway, wearing a standard Earth military uniform and looking slightly confused. "Sorry to interrupt," Morrison said, running a hand through his disheveled brown hair. "I was looking for the bathroom on Deck 7 and somehow ended up here. This station has really confusing signage." The arch calculator's response was immediate. "Impossible. You have breached 17 impossible barriers. Probability of accidental access, 0. Morrison shrugged, a gesture that had become universally recognized as uniquely human. "Yeah, that happens to me a lot. I once got lost in Toronto and somehow ended up in Moscow. Never did figure that one out." He looked around the chamber with interest. "So, what's this meeting about?" The council exchanged glances through various sensory organs. Finally, the eldest member, a gaseous being from the nebula reaches whose name was an unpronounceable harmony of electromagnetic frequencies, spoke through its translation matrix. "Captain Morrison, we are discussing humanity's apparent ability to manipulate probability itself. Your arrival here, through impossible means, rather proves our point." Morrison laughed, and several species instinctively took a step back. There was something about human laughter that suggested they were in on a joke that the universe itself didn't fully understand. Manipulate probability? Nah, we don't do that. We just... He paused, searching for words. We just refuse to accept impossible. It's kind of our thing. Dr. Chun entered the chamber behind him, somehow equally unsurprised to find herself in an impossible location. Jake, there you are. We have that situation in the Corvin system. Their sun is going Nova 17 years ahead of schedule, and they need evacuation assistance. The Council turned their collective attention to this new crisis. The Corvin system housed 12 billion souls across 6 planets. Their sun, a previously stable yellow dwarf, had spontaneously begun its death sequence. Every model, every calculation, every quantum prediction said the same thing. Evacuation was impossible. The nova would occur in 6 days. Moving 12 billion beings would take 6 months minimum. Morrison pulled out a tablet and studied the data. Yeah, this is pretty bad. Standard evacuation won't work. He looked up at the Council. But what if we don't evacuate them? The arch calculator's response was sharp. Alternative: extinction. No other possibilities exist within physical laws. Physical laws, Morrison mused. Those are more like guidelines, really. He turned to Chun. Remember that thing we did with the colony ship that got stuck in a black hole's event horizon? Chun's eyes lit up with that particular gleam that made other species deeply nervous. Oh, you mean when we convinced the black hole it had already eaten them, so it let them go? Exactly. Morrison turned back to the Council. What if we convinced the sun it already went nova? Just skip to the part where it's done and stable again? The silence that followed was profound. Finally, the gaseous elder spoke. That is not how stellar physics works. It is if the sun thinks it is, Morrison replied matter-of-factly. Look, I'm not saying we actually change the laws of physics. We just suggest an alternative interpretation. Humans are really good at that. We've been doing it our whole history. Someone says something's impossible, we say, bet, and then reality gets confused and lets us do it anyway. The Council watched in stunned silence as Morrison and Chun began planning the impossible. They would send a human fleet to the Corvin system, not to evacuate, but to have a conversation with the sun, to suggest strongly that perhaps it had miscalculated its own life cycle, that perhaps the nova was just a practice run, a stellar hiccup, nothing more. 3 days later, Kex Verlian stood on the observation deck of the Council flagship, watching the human fleet surround the dying star. 117 human vessels, each one broadcasting something they called confidence waves, which, when the arch calculator analyzed them, turned out to be nothing more than human brainwaves, expressing the absolute certainty that everything would work out fine. The sun stopped expanding not then, impossibly. It began to contract. Within 6 hours, it had returned to stable fusion, as if the past week had been nothing more than a stellar bad dream. Every law of physics said this was impossible. The energy required to reverse stellar collapse didn't exist. The quantum mechanics involved couldn't be resolved. Yet there it was, a perfectly healthy yellow dwarf, shining as if nothing had happened. Captain Morrison's report was brief. We asked it nicely to reconsider. It did. The Quantum Council reconvened immediately. The implications were staggering. Humans weren't manipulating probability. They were something far more disturbing. They were creatures that existed partially outside the agreed-upon rules of reality. Not through technology, not through evolution, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept that some things couldn't be done. The arch calculator presented its final analysis. Human consciousness appears to exist in a state of quantum rebellion. They observe reality not as it is, but as it could be, and their observation collapses probability waves in directions that should not be possible. They are not reality manipulators. They are reality negotiators. Dr. Chun, who had somehow appeared in the chamber again, despite it being re-encrypted with even more impossible barriers, nodded thoughtfully. That sounds about right, though we prefer to think of it as aggressive optimism. The gaseous elder pulsed with colors that indicated deep thought. If this is true, then humanity represents either the greatest threat or the greatest opportunity the galaxy has ever encountered. Both, Chun said simply. We're both. That's kind of the point. Binary choices are for species that accept the rules. We make our own. The Council made its decision that day. Humanity would be given a new role in galactic civilization. Not as mediators or warriors or traders, but as something entirely unique, probability consultants. When faced with impossible situations, when the laws of physics themselves seemed to prohibit solutions, they would call in the humans, not to change reality, but to suggest, firmly and with complete confidence, that perhaps reality had been looking at things from the wrong angle all along. Within a year, human possibility firms had opened throughout the galaxy. Their services were simple. They helped other species see options that didn't exist until humans pointed them out. Mining companies discovered they could extract resources from stars by asking politely. Shipping companies learned that space-time was surprisingly flexible if you approached it with the right attitude. Agricultural worlds found that plants grew better when humans suggested they might enjoy it. The galaxy had thought. It understood humans when they arrived. Just another sapient species, remarkable only for their adaptability and stubborn survival instinct. They hadn't realized that human stubbornness extended to the fundamental laws of reality itself. That when a human said, "We'll figure it out," the universe itself leaned in to see what impossible solution they would discover. Ambassador Kex Verlian kept his records right up until the day he retired, 500 years later. By then, the galaxy had been transformed, not through conquest or technology, but through the simple introduction of a species that looked at the impossible and said, "Yeah, but what if we tried anyway?" His final entry was brief. Humans remain impossible. This appears to be the point. The coin Dr. Chun had given him still stood on its edge on his desk, 5 centuries later, defying probability with quiet, human persistence. Asterisk,